everybody, in today's video we're going to be going over a slightly colder pattern which is going to be taking place over the next few weeks. This is going to probably stay all the way through December, or at least the first part of December, so we're going to probably get in on a bit more cold and snow. So snow will definitely be ramping up over the next few days, and we've already seen that. We already had that snowstorm, of course, over in the Midwest and the Great Lakes and eventually into the interior Northeast, and it looks like in the next 1 to 2 weeks we're going to have a couple more of those type of events. So things are definitely not slowing down. We're going to be talking about the general pattern today, but this is going to be a little bit different from what we've been doing recently, just because we don't have any big storms to talk about right now. We're going to, again, be focusing on the overall pattern and giving you an idea of what to expect with that. So here's a look at what the weather photo of the day is from Francesca. She's in central Indiana, showing some of the snow that fell over there yesterday. We had a couple tenths of an inch of snow for most of these spots, even some areas in central Indiana reporting up to an inch of snowfall. Again, it was not a ton of snowfall like expected, but it did stick a little bit, especially to those grassy surfaces, but also to some of the warmer surfaces like metal, such as the top of this light pole right there, where they got a little bit of snowfall. So this was sticking around. It did take a while, according to some of the reports from there, to actually stick. So it did take at least half an hour to an hour for this to stick in most places, and even more in some spots. But eventually it did stick for many, and you ended up getting your first snowfall of season for a lot of people as well. If you guys want to have your pictures featured, send them over to my email address at elitheweatherguyyt@gmail.com. It's also in the description down below. And then just write a general location of where you took that from. So again, it does not have to be anything specific, but just write a general area, and then I'll feature it in the video, and make sure that it is weather related. So preferably it would be of something more recent, but even if it's not, even if it's an older weather photo that you have, send that over. And especially once we get a lot more snow and cold and ice and things like that, if you guys want to send in your snowfall or storm photos, feel free to do so. Even if they were from the storm yesterday and you still have them and you want to send them in, feel free to do so, and you guys could definitely do that if you want to. So here's a look at the current National Weather Service page. We have a few winter weather advisories up in Washington, as well as for northern Maine. I believe that's Aroostook County in Maine. We also have some flood watches up in western Washington. And then we have, and they actually do have some flooding, especially in southern British Columbia. I've seen some reports that there's been some flooding up in that area. So hopefully no damage or nothing severe in that area. We also have some wind advisories in the light brown. In the golden color, we have the high wind warnings. In the high wind watches are in the more of the darker golden color, which you see for a little bit of Wyoming and South Dakota. And then because of all that wind, we actually do have a few red flag warnings up for fire danger in parts of Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Nebraska, and Wyoming. We also have some frost advisories in that lighter blue color for parts of North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, as well as for parts of eastern North Carolina, where they have a freeze warning currently in place. Now, yesterday we had a high temperature of 97 degrees in Camp Pendleton, California. The low temperature was 9 degrees in Angel Fire, New Mexico. Highest rainfall report was in Neilton, Washington, where they got 2.6 inches of rainfall. And the highest snowfall report was 8 inches in Pencer, Minnesota, which is all the way up in northwestern Minnesota. Here's a look at the snowfall reports from yesterday, because it is interesting to look at what actually transpired. So anywhere in this darker blue this darker blue shade, that's where you're looking at 3 to 6 inches, and then 6 to 8 inches in the first shade of yellow, second shade of yellow right here, or almost an orange color. That's where you're at 8 to 12 inches, and then you can kind of see that little area where you have even a deeper orange. That's where you have 12 plus inches of snowfall. So overall, you had a big broad area of 3 to 6 inches throughout North Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and then you also saw some lake effect driven snowfall snowfall in the UP of Michigan as well as for western Michigan as well. This is over the past 72 hours when this is all valid for. You, of course, saw some amount of snowfall, some trace snowfall through parts of southeastern Michigan, parts of northern Indiana, central and northern Ohio, and even into areas of western Pennsylvania. And then once you got especially into areas around Cleveland to Buffalo, so within that corridor right there, you saw some heavier amounts of snowfall, right around 2 to 6 inches or more of snow in that area. The Adirondacks and the Green and White Mountains also got in on their fair share of snowfall, but the lower spots, so even some of these valleys in Vermont and New Hampshire, did not see nearly as much snowfall as the mountain areas. We also saw that in some of the Appalachians, so for some parts of West Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, we did have some light to even moderate amounts of snowfall up into that area. So we saw quite a bit of snow. It was really a widespread snowfall, but in terms of the quantity, if you really wanted some heavier amounts of snow, you were going to have to go up further to the north into the Midwest or up into parts of these lake effect areas. So for, let's say, northwestern Pennsylvania, western New York, the Adirondacks, or even the Green and White Mountains. So it was fairly far interior where you saw those bigger amounts of snow, but there was a fairly wide area that just saw at least a coating of snow yesterday. So here's a look at the 500 millibar map, and we're going to start taking you through this. The blue, green, and even purple colors are indicating where you have some low pressure, and what low pressure would generally mean is that we have some colder air or stormier weather associated with it. So usually they are associated with a storm. So in this case, we do have a little storm system moving across parts of Saskatchewan up in Canada. We also have another trough and low pressure center into parts of Nova Scotia at this point. That would actually be the storm that was in the Great Lakes and then eventually made its way to the east. So these storms are all coming back and bringing in colder temperatures as they move by. Now, again, like I've been saying for the past few weeks, this is not going to be anything that's going to stay in place. You're not going to see anything that's going to stay the same for 3 or more weeks at a time, or even 2 or more weeks at a time. Really, the maximum is going to be a 10-day stretch where it might be similar weather. But for the most part, you're going to see a little bit of cold air, maybe for 3, 4, 5 days. Then you might get 1 or 2 days of warmer, milder air, and then you go back to a 3, 4, or 5 day stretch of colder temperatures. Maybe you squeeze in a snow event here or there in between those little pockets of warm air, but that's generally going to be the pattern. And the reason that's happening is because we have this kind of really fast moving pattern where we have storms coming in from the west coast, you have ridging in between them, and then you have another storm which is going to be on the other end of that high pressure center. So as these storms are moving onto the west coast, they're bringing in colder air, and then once those move across Canada and the United States, they bring that cold air along with them. So for example, if you were to have a low pressure center like we did just a couple of days ago in the Great Lakes, you would also have a trough most likely into that area as well, indicating that you would have colder temperatures. So it's really going to be a fairly steady moving pattern. It's going to be predictable. You're going to have predictable storms which are going to move in and out at a fairly steady rate. But it will be a little bit hectic at times, especially if we get any bigger storms that could really toss up the pattern. If we get any storms that really wind up, that could, of course, cause some issues in the forecast, and that would make it a little bit more trickier when it comes to the long range. So this would be by Wednesday of this week. You can see that in parts of the northern plains and central Canada, we have a little low pressure center up there. This is going to be a storm that's going to pass by to our north. So if you live up in southern Canada, you might get in on a little bit of snow, but generally it'll be sliding across Quebec and Ontario. You might see some brief snowfall in the interior northeast right behind the system. It's going to be very brief, not going to really add up to all that much. And behind the system, you're actually going to get some rather chilly air followed by some milder air. So This is for Thursday. Here's for Friday of this week. And you can see that's that trough into the northeast. The central United States has that high pressure. And then in the northwest, we have the low pressure. So as you can see, if we went back 5 days, you would see pretty much the exact same pattern. If you remember, when we started off, the first frame had a low pressure center into Nova Scotia. And then it had another one into Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. It was basically like this with a high pressure center right in the middle. Now we see that same exact pattern, but maybe just a few miles further to the west. So we see that low pressure center into the northeast, and then we see the low pressure also into the northwest, and then right over the middle is where you have some high pressure or ridging. So this pattern is going to be continuing. You're going to have a solid part of the country under some chillier air on either side, and then you'll have that little pocket of warmer or milder air, maybe just by a couple of degrees. It's not going to be awfully warm, but it will feel definitely noticeably warmer compared to the other days. If we move this on to Saturday of this week, you have a little system moving across the Midwest. This is when you would get warmer if you live in the East for the weekend. And then we go into Sunday and Monday especially. And this is when it would start to get colder. We have ridging throughout the Northwest. We have troughing into the Midwest and the Great Lakes. And then we have another little area of warmer air rising up along the East Coast. And then eventually, if we move this on to Monday, you can see that the low pressure system now is over the East Coast instead of being further to the west. And now that high pressure, which was originally up in Oregon and off the shore of Oregon, is now into parts of Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming. So it is all moving further to the east, and it's all moving together further to the east. By the way, the reason that we have such a deep trough into the east is because we have such an expansive high pressure system further to the west. So if you ever see an amplified system on either side of the country, expect that the next system that follows is probably going to also be amplified. So if you get a really, really strong high pressure system into the west, expect that you would see the complete opposite on the other side of the country, where you would have colder air rushing in to that part of the country. That's generally how these systems type to work. These patterns tend to work, where you have one pattern on one side of the country and the complete opposite pattern on the other. So just to give you an idea that this will not just be a colder pattern, this will also be a snowier pattern. Now, just looking at the next 10 days, what I really want to focus in on is not going to be whatever snow is happening down here, because I know that's going to catch everybody's attention. But what I want to focus in on more is what's happening up in Canada, because this is going to be where your cold air is coming from. So, of course, when you have snow on the ground, when you have a decent snowpack on the ground, and that means that that source of cold air is going to be a few degrees colder. So having this now expanding and building snowpack up into British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and even into some of these provinces further to the east like Ontario and Quebec will be very important. You already have a decent snowpack, not too much, but a decent one built up into northernmost Canada, so into the territories and also up near Alaska. But we haven't really seen that move into southern or central Canada up to this point, and now it looks like this next 10-day or 15-day stretch is when that's going to start to happen. So of course you can see that we might have a few passing systems into the east, and again, this is just one model run. I'm not really taking any note into this, so I know again everybody's attention is going to be caught to whatever's happening down here. That's probably not going to happen, but what again I really want to showcase is what's happening up in Canada, as well as just generally how some of the snow is now starting to fill up the map a lot more than it was maybe just a week or two ago. Here's a look at the EPO, or actually the Arctic Oscillation. So this is the EPS model, the European Ensemble model, and it's taking a look at the Arctic Oscillation, which is, of course, over the Arctic Circle, and it's showing you that we are going into a bit of a negative pattern. So right now, we're right around 1 standard deviation above the mean. We're actually going to be staying around there for the next few days, probably the next 5 or so days, and then most of these ensemble models bring this down to about maybe 1 to 3 standard deviations below the mean. That is fairly good if you like cold and snow, especially in the central or eastern United States, because what that means is that you have a more unstable Arctic Circle and polar vortex. So when you have that up there where it's a little bit more erratic and it will move around a little bit more, that means that you can see some of that cold air move down into the United States and southern Canada with a lot more ease than you would be able to have if you did not have that same Arctic oscillation in that position. So if you had a positive Arctic oscillation, typically that would mean that you would have a wound up, built up polar vortex that if it came down would be very, very cold. But the problem is that it probably won't come down because of how strong it is. So the weaker the polar vortex, and I know it sounds counterintuitive, but the weaker the polar vortex, the more cold air you'll actually see. It might not be with the same severity. You might not be 20 degrees below zero, but it's going to be enough cold air to bring you some snowfall for most parts of the country. So while if you live in the southeast or maybe the southern plains, you would want to see a stronger polar vortex because you would need more cold air to be pushed further to the south to get your snow. But if you live in, let's say, anywhere in the northern half of the country, you really want a negative AO. And even for parts of the southern half of the country, you would also want a negative AO because you do need some amount of cold air. So if it's all bound up together, you're really not going to see too much of that fill into the U.S. Now let's look at another important oscillation. This is the EPO, and this one is going to be moving around quite a bit. You can see that it takes a few dips. It actually starts up one standard deviation above the mean, then it goes up two, maybe goes down to near the neutral line, and then eventually just plateaus around that neutral line. And you can see there is wide variance. So this is the 5 percentile line. Here's the 95th percentile line, and you can see how big of a difference there is. So there are some models that have it all the way up here, and there are some models that have it all the way down here, indicating that just because the majority of the models are right here, there is still some amount of models and a decent chunk that are in the negative category, which really for the EPO, you just want to see that this is moving around, that it's not staying at the same rate, which it is, and you also want to see that this is at least close to that zero line, which right now it is, and also that it might move down near the negative line, which towards the end of the period, it actually does start to do that. So overall, I don't think this will have too big of an impact on the pattern, considering that it's not really moving too high or below that zero line. Here's the PNA, the Pacific North American Index, and this is also the same idea. You would want this to either stay near that zero line or preferably actually in the east, you would want this to be positive, and in a lot of cases, this is maybe going to take a sharp dip over the next couple of days, but eventually it plateaus and actually moves up near or actually above that zero line. So you start to get into a positive PNA. This covers the North American plate and especially over the western half of North America. So for maybe the west coast of the United States, the west coast of Canada, and also the eastern Pacific, this is where this would cover for. And when you have warmer temperatures into that area, generally that would mean that you would have colder temperatures into the east. So that's the logic behind wanting a positive PNA. Now, of course, if you live in the west and you want colder temperatures, you would want the opposite. You would want a negative PNA. But for the purposes of this video, because the pattern we're going into is colder for the east, I'm just generally saying that for a lot of these people, you're going to want to have a below normal PNA actually an above normal PNA, because that would indicate that you would have colder temperatures into the east. Now moving this on to the North American Index, which is the NAO, you're going to see a lot of people talk about this, and you're going to hear a lot of people talk about this because it is one of those that it really does have a big play on the pattern, especially through January and February. I don't think it has too much of a play as we get into November and December, but it is something you want to watch out for. If this is way positive, then you're probably going to see this correlate with the PNA, the EPO, the AO. A lot of these oscillations are not just standalone. If you have a negative NAO, there's a fairly good chance that you have a neutral or negative AO, and if you have a positive PNA, well, there's a fairly good shot that you also probably have a negative or somewhat negative NAO as well. So these are not disconnected. They do have some correlation with each other, and if one goes positive, the other may go negative, and there are patterns within these. Now, this covers the area south of Greenland, and you would want this to have a negative bent, because when it does do that, you tend to see more blocking up into that area, more blocking up into eastern Canada especially, which can help pour down some cold air into the east. So right now it is maybe a couple standard deviations above the mean, but look what happens right around the 19th or 20th. We go down into that negative phase, and you can see that even the 95th percentile of some of these models doesn't bring it up above that zero line until the 25th. So this could be a fairly deep stretch of slightly or moderately colder temperatures for the east if this were to play out, and if all of these oscillations kind of keep at it. Now, the only one that might cause some issues and might keep it from being a constant colder pattern is that EPO. Because it is positive, there are a lot of systems flowing in from the Pacific, so that doesn't mean that not everything is going to stay just within the east. So not all the storms are going to be in the east. You will have some coming in from the northwest, and in between those two systems, you're probably going to have some warmer air. So there will be, again, a couple days where you are warmer, but as a general pattern, if you were to average things out, I think you will probably be going into a generally colder pattern, especially if you live anywhere east of the Rockies, and especially so if you live from the Midwest and northern plains on eastward. So that is going to wrap it up for today's video. If you have any questions or comments, just leave them down below. If you have any weather photos that you guys want to send in, send them over to my email address, which is in the description down below. And I'll see you guys tomorrow. Goodbye.